Hello, welcome Rumblers. And look who we have with us today. Is everybody, let's just first thing we got to do. See, this is such a beginning show, you see, so I have to check, make sure we've got everybody going in our different streams. Okay, so first thing is, do we have Rumble going? If so, say hi. And then also in YouTube's, want to make sure YouTube's is going. Rumblers, are you here? Live stream begins at 8. It's 8 o'clock. I'm right on time. I'm never late, am I? Oh, Matt himself is here. Okay, I see her. It's working. And what about YouTube's, guys? We're a professional operation here. Can you say hello? Yes. Hi, David. We got David, Otto, Cro-Magnon, Mignon. Yeah, you're here on YouTube. Good, good, good. And Matt himself. Matt himself, you're in both. And Bella the Bayou. So we have with us today, and I am really blessed. And one of the things, we've kind of had a downtime in the law streaming community. There haven't been a lot of hot live Johnny Depp type trials, right? And so I've been just getting over a cold and also catching up on my work and writing a new book. But in the meantime, I said, what am I going to do? Am I just going to start just doing everything, fiddling my thumbs and having drinking streams, which may yet come? But I said, what I might do is I might do like a series of forensic interviews, interviews with people who are experts in their field about law forensics, so that when the next trial comes around, you will have a firm groundwork in these digital forensics. And now we've already had a fingerprint expert on. We had Chris Fabricant, who is the Innocence Project director, who is an expert on junk science and bite marks and a lot of stuff, a brilliant man. And today, Tiffany Roy, forensic aide, DNA expert. Would you give us a little brief bio of where you're coming from?
So I started my career at a government lab in Massachusetts as a bench level analyst. I got all my training there. I moved from there to a private lab in Florida. And then after the private laboratory, I went into private practice. I have a law degree. I actually went to law school at night when I was at the Massachusetts State Police. So I can be very helpful when it comes to making things plain in court, teaching in the courtroom, what things work, what they don't when it comes to science communication.
Right. And I wanted you on to talk about DNA because I think it was last night or the night before, I had Chris Fabricant on and we were talking, of course, DNA has exploded onto the scene of criminal justice. And in a lot of, it's shined a very negative light on many other forensic sciences because of the precision and the firm scientific basis for DNA. But and I do want to talk about that, but I also kind of want to talk with you about the limitations on DNA, because there's really, and I talked about this with Chris, there's really no substitute for just good hard police work. And this is a problem that I think we overly rely on these magic scientific missiles, and when in fact they can be very helpful, or they can be not helpful at all, or they can be inconclusive. Like let's start at the very beginning. When you have a crime scene evidence collection, right?
Yeah.
The evidentiary value of DNA is very much dependent on the crime scene. Could you elaborate on that?
So I have a case that has bothered me for a couple of years. It's a Broward County case, and the defendant's name is, they call him Moochie. His name is Deontay Razilis. And essentially, there was a homicide. Jill Halliburton Sue was killed in her home. She was stabbed multiple times, 25 times. She was bound. And there was a mountain of other evidence, circumstantial evidence that indicated that it could be some other party. And they had the family come in and they interviewed them. But at some point during the collection process at the crime scene, there was a DNA swab taken of some items that maybe are not even related to the crime itself. And they uploaded those swabs some days later, and the DNA, major DNA profile on one of the items matched to Deontay Razilis. And the entire trajectory of that investigation changed course. and the only evidence that they had that tied this person to the crime was that DNA profile. And these are police officers at the crime scene collecting these swabs and processing this evidence, and they don't know what a DNA analyst might know, and they're not as careful as a DNA analyst might be. They don't know how sensitive our systems are and how easily it is to contaminate evidence. And this person was a serial burglar, and my great fear was always that, even if his DNA was in the crime scene, it was from some transfer event from the exterior of the home or from
Okay, well, let's focus on this very point, because that's one of the issues about DNA. And I know that we have a lot of people that are in the chats, and a lot of people that are kind of watch me are interested in the Zachariah Anderson case. And I know that you're not familiar with that case, but when I heard about that case, and I didn't follow the trial, and I'm sort of an outsider looking in, right? But there's a lot of people that are very interested and think that was a miscarriage of justice. And what basically they really hung their hat on a very pinprick dot of theoretical DNA match on a particular place. Well, and talk about. I was saying that the police work was so sloppy that the danger of cross contamination was great. That the first thing I look for is was the scene controlled? Were the people, because what they will actually have is they will put the crime scene tape up, and anytime somebody crosses that, they will take a log. They will control who goes in and out of that scene. Talk about those kind of controls and how that's required and how cross contamination can affect a case.
Well, that's essentially what happened with JonBenet Ramsey and what happened with O.J. Simpson, with cases that are big and sensational like that, where you might have a department that doesn't handle those kinds of crimes all that often, and it attracts a lot of attention. The failure to protect the crime scene is something that can damage the rest of the evidence. It's garbage. We say garbage in, garbage out. So all of that work that's going to take place after that will be for naught if the crime scene integrity wasn't protected.
And I mean, I had a case, and I can't talk about it too much because I represented the client, and a client who was convicted and on appeal. But I will say that it was an Orlando murder case, and I was blown away by the quality of the police work, because they came upon a crime scene, and the responding officers immediately recognized it was a murder scene, immediately backed off, taped it off, secured the scene, called the murder lab, the murder unit, and they did such an outstanding job. And I hate to even reveal all the things that they did, because it was brilliant police work from the Orlando Police Department, and it would not have been solved had it not been for that good, hard, careful work. Whereas you don't always get that on your initial responding officers, or even the higher ups. It depends on the department, wouldn't you say?
Right. I think that's the difference between JonBenet Ramsey's case being solved and not being solved. So it really starts there. And so, a big part of my struggle is that we have no control over law enforcement. We can't force them to train. We can't force them to understand. In the DNA lab, we still have instances of contamination. And so you have the highest level of training inside the DNA lab. You have the cleanest procedures. You buy sterile equipment. And the police officers on the front line may not be doing that. They don't maybe know that how easy it would be for a fingerprint brush to transfer DNA from one item to the next item. So, it's really just a scary thing when you just have the DNA. When it's just the DNA.
Yeah, when it's simply, and location, because, for example, if there was a murder in my house, my DNA is all over this house, right? So the presence of my DNA at a crime scene, if it's a place that I'm always at, then it's not an issue, right? And let's talk about this, because I get a chance to use my K-bar example. I don't know if you're familiar with the Idaho murder case.
Of course I am.
And I think I'm excited about this case. We're covering it with Megan Fox, and the K-bar. This is a K-bar knife like they used, and the leather sheath. This is the K-bar knife, but the leather sheath that it's held in was found next to the body, and DNA of the defendant was found on the snap of the sheath next to the body. Now, you see, that is the kind of forensic DNA that is powerful because of the location, the item it's located on, the position next to the body. All of those things make that a very high evidentiary value DNA strike.
Right. And he would have no reason for his DNA to be there.
Right.
But
And so that would be my first question as a defense lawyer is, how do we explain the DNA on the snap of the K-bar knife, right?
And in the same token, I expect there will be, and I know that there is other evidence, video evidence, and some of
Right.
the things that have already been presented. But that's what the danger is with forensic genetic genealogy, is that oftentimes we're going back to these ancient cases and we are testing one item of evidence, and the investigators are dead and witnesses are dead and they don't have anything else. And the danger in that, when you have a murder, a sexual assault, and they've tested a vaginal swab, how do you ever overcome, the consent defense? And it's really just a slippery slope. And that's why I think it's a really important point to make, that there should always be something else. DNA is powerful evidence. It can be very powerful evidence, but it is not foolproof. This is a human process and people make mistakes and rare events happen, and there should always be something else. If I was a juror.
And let's talk about this. So we have the danger of cross-contamination. We have the danger of planted evidence. We have the danger of, that's the straight police corruption. We have the danger of DNA that has no meaning, meaningless DNA, in that, like for my DNA in my house is really meaningless evidence. Now, what do you say about? Wait, hold on a second. It's mom. Mom's calling me. How are you done? Right. So sorry about that. We're at home. It's Friday night, right? You can free to drink. By the way, my chat is known for buying people drinks.
Oh, I wish I had known that, because it's about wine o'clock for me.
It's wine o'clock. So $100 a drink. One of us will drink for $100. Okay, and Lord of the Ree has already contributed $5, and thank you for the $5 and not the $1, Lord. he's known for $1, multiple $1. But let's see. Lord of the Ree says, Steve, going to dinner with my brother in a bit, but I'll be catching replay later. Good job. Just wanted to drop by and say hello. Love you, brother. God bless, and God bless you. Yes, Mama Gosney's doing good. She just got through cancer treatment, so she's doing good.
God bless her.
So anyways. Yeah, so we're talking. I want to talk about lab error, because you talked about the human element of this. Tell me a little bit about how lab error can creep into this error process.
It happens. There's contamination all the time in crime labs, and I know that I've made mistakes myself in the laboratory. This is really hard work. We're working with little tiny tubes and little tiny measurements of liquid and particles of DNA that you can't see with the naked eye. This is really, really technical stuff. And so mistakes are going to happen. Instruments are going to fail, and every human process that's going to happen. And this can happen on multiple levels. It can happen, on a case specific level. It could be problems in a validation or in a standard operating procedure that are not correct.
You have dealt with one of my favorite defense lawyers in our office is Rosemary Peoples, and
yes.
She's one of our capital trial attorneys, and she's one of the best around. And what she always gets, and it's like not enough to get the results. She wants to see the bench notes.
Yes.
And talk, because I think you have actually written a book on these very topics. Is this correct?
I've written a book, so most of my textbooks are about forensics in general. So I haven't written anything that's specific just to DNA and in the work that I'm doing now. But the bench notes are so important. That's where all that information is going to come from. And I get cases where contamination has happened or a sample has been lost for some reason or another. If there's a hair and the electricity in the room takes the hair and they can't find the evidence hair, those things are contained in the notes. And it's extremely important to go through the notes very thoroughly with someone who can understand them. I have a case right now where someone is being accused in Miami of sexual assault, and the body swabs that they tested showed no male DNA, but that wasn't reported. The report actually said that a sample that had more DNA was taken forward, that had more male DNA, but it didn't say those other two samples from the person's body had no male DNA detected. And that's a point that's really important. And the attorney would not have known that if they didn't have me going through the case file notes.
Well, and let's talk about, and so let's take back way up now, because we've I hit some hot little erogenous Jones buttons, right? So let's go back to the basics, okay? Let's talk about a perfect DNA world case, okay? What would you like to say? Let's use the Idaho example. Let's project onto it. Let's pretend like the DNA found on that snap is the best that evidentiary wise that you could expect. What would I be describing to you, and how would that be reflected?
That would be a full single source profile from one individual. And the way that I describe this to lay people is that single source DNA profiles are very descriptive. They tell us a lot. It's very clear information. We can tell what information pairs with what else. So I think about this in the same way I think about a physical description of a perpetrator from a witness. If a witness can describe somebody, their hair color, their eye color, their height, their weight, maybe unique markings, face tattoo, the more information that you compound and the clearer that information is, the more specifically that's going to describe a particular individual, maybe not to the exclusion of all others, because we're not using those kinds of terms. We don't identify source, but it describes someone with a lot of specificity. And so we can rule out a lot of people using that information. And some DNA profiles are not like that. So I think if Koberger was the best case scenario, we are working with a clean single source male DNA profile on that item. And
now let's talk about, because one of the things that we see when we see DNA analysts testify in court is it will be like, this is a 1 in 3 quadrillion chance, right, of being similar. Now, the way I understand that math is calculated, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, say there's 13 different chromosomes that you're looking for in a DNA profile, right? How many is it 13, or what's the number?
Chromosomes?
Yeah, well, isn't there like, there's
the locations that we're looking at?
Locations that you're looking at that are distinctive to the individual, because most people's chromosome makeup is the same. Most human beings are identical, except these certain things that make you an individual. So you look to these genetic markers that are individualized. So for example, if you have this one here, number 1 allele is, 1 out of every 500 people that has this per marker, and then 1 every 3,000 has this one, and then you just multiply that over time, and that's how you come up with the number. And that's why it's a factor of percentages, right? Is that a correct view of the way DNA works?
Yes, it's compounding information, and the chance of randomly having that collection of traits, is likely rare. The more information you add, the more rare and the more descriptive that profile becomes. And right now we have kits that look at 24 different locations and 21 autosomal locations. So it's a lot of information. And so it can be very discriminating, but we also have profiles that are not very discriminating. So it's important to keep in mind that not all DNA profiles are created equal.
Now, if you had like a severed finger, you would be able to get a very good DNA profile off this, because that's a large tissue sample, right?
It depends on the state of decomposition, but if it's a fresh finger, then yes,
fresh finger. You could tell it was a male finger as opposed to a female finger.
I don't know. Maybe not. I've seen some things.
You've seen some things, but if it was a freshly chopped finger,
we would be able to test it and know if the person was genetically male or female. Yeah.
And a lot of this is because of the like, I know that they use this in body identification in warfare, is that they would collect body parts. I'm thinking about the finger from the guy they blew up with the missile, and then all they had left was his finger, right? And they were able to identify him through family genetics, because they said, okay, this is the male figure of this family genetic, and they were able to put it down to this particular person and confirm that thumb came from this dude that they blew up with the missile, right? So But then now we're talking about degradation of DNA over time. So there are environmental factors, there are preservative factors, right? I mean, some things, if you drop into a mud swamp, in a cold mud swamp, you could preserve for a long time. But if you were out in the hot sun, maybe less so, right? I mean, could you talk about some of the factors that impact the ability to the genetics over time?
Right. So DNA profiles can persist if they are stored in ideal conditions. I think, you know, for thousands of years. We do ancient DNA testing, from the Romanovs, and we can test things that are extremely, extremely old, and the
Did you
DNA.
hear about up in Brevard County, they actually found brains of people that had died in this swamp from like 10,000 years ago. And the genetic DNA in the brains was still intact.
I did not read that, but I would have to look into it, because things like bacteria and soil, they degrade DNA. So if the brain was, kept intact and it was in the center and it was
It was in
protected.
it was basically buried in a spring mud pit. It was right here. University of Florida was involved in the excavation. It's fascinating because I think they were Timucuan Indians, and they were able to really do a lot of work. There's a whole field of archaeological DNA, which is kind of what you're talking about, the Roman.
Yeah.
Well, back to our theory. Okay, so we talked about the perfect DNA profile as a single source, freshly blown off thumb, something like that. And now we're talking about some cells. Most cells contain your entire. So every cell of your body pretty much contains your entire genetic profile, but some cells are better than others. What are some of the worst cells?
So red blood cells don't have a nucleus. They're enucleated when they're mature, so they don't contain DNA. And so
the platelets.
Nope, the red blood cells. And so they're in blood. We have blood platelets, we have white blood cells and red blood cells, and we get the DNA profiles from the white blood cells. And so every other type of cell in your body should have the same DNA profile. And sometimes we see some strange things that happen with hair and other keratinized cells, but in general, all of the cells in your body are going to have the same genetic code.
So generally, red blood cells and hair are more difficult. Now, if the hair has the root pulled out, the root is generally good, but the actual hair cell is not as good, right?
Well, there are technologies that can profile some information from the hair shaft now. And so technology is advancing in this field every single day. But essentially, for the normal everyday kind of testing, there are some samples that are better than others. The best sample, if we're going to be testing somebody to compare, is a cheek swab. We call it a buccal swab from the inside of someone's mouth. Blood is generally a good sample. Other forensically important, fluids are semen and saliva. But we can develop DNA profiles from trace DNA, which is maybe just a few cells from a bunch of different people who have touched an item or spoken near an item, coughed on an item. So there's a lot we can do now.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit, okay? Because now let's get into the more edgy DNA stuff. Okay, the first thing is what you just referred to as touch DNA.
No, trace DNA. I would never call it touch DNA.
Okay, well, tell me about the promise and the limitation of touch DNA or trace DNA.
It's a blessing and a curse. Essentially, we're able to get DNA profiles from very little genetic material, very little biological material. But then we have to ask ourselves if that biological material is even relevant to the crime. Could it have been transferred there by some other means, indirect? And so it's really a double-edged sword. We're getting more complex mixtures because we're detecting a few cells from many different people. And the profiles have a lot of uncertainty. So when I describe these to lay people, I describe them on the opposite end of the spectrum. Of the gold standard, we have these crappy mixture samples, which maybe give you information, that's like maybe 6 foot tall blackmail. And there's
now let's talk about the dangers of mixed DNAs. And I mean, not to get too gross, but I remember I had a sex offense case where the girl was accusing one guy of rape, and there were 3 genetic profiles that were contained within the. It was a mixture DNA, which impacted the. Let's just say it impacted the strength of the prosecution case because of the mixture, right? But it also that has an impact on the science of it and about creating matches. Tell me about the problems about mixed DNA matches. I mean, Fabricant talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, so it's just like all the other pattern matching disciplines. You're looking at a conglomerate of traits, and maybe one or two of those you could find a defendant that has one or two of those. But is it by chance that those were contributed, by other people that also have those traits? So it's a jumble of information. Some of my colleagues will describe it as like the fruit smoothie. Sometimes when you load everything into the blender, you can see the distribution of strawberries and you can see the distribution of pineapple, and you might know what the ratios are for each. And then as soon as you hit that blend button, you might be able to detect that maybe there's some pineapple there, but you won't be able to know the ratio and the measurements. So there's just a lot of uncertainty that surrounds that kind of interpretation. And it's just not as informative as the really clear information.
Well, and I know that you are employed by defense teams to review state work and all over the country, really, I think, right? I mean, you're not just limited to Florida or New Hampshire, right? You're all over the country, right?
Yes, I have a case from Israel. I have a case from Germany. So, wherever
and just so we can promote properly, if somebody wants to contact Tiffany Roy in her business, if they're a defense work and they want to have a secondary set of eyes on something the state provides you from their state crime lab, how would they contact you?
So I have a website. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I always recommend for attorneys to follow me on LinkedIn because I post a lot of examples of flawed work. And I think people just have this opinion of DNA that it's such a strong science, is firmly rooted in scientific foundation, but errors and mistakes happen all the time. And so it's just not, it's not what people think it is. So you can search for me on LinkedIn, and then also my website is www.forensicaid.net. And then my direct email is just my name, tiffany.roy@gmail.com.
And, and this is, you are very correct. And I know something about DNA, but I will say that whenever we have a DNA case, there are specialists, I would say there's attorneys within our office that have more scientific backgrounds who are better with this type of evidence. And so in our office, as a public defender's office, we always associate that person with our case and let them handle the DNA and the forensic science piece of it, because it can get technical. And if you can get bamboozled by these credentials, and I talked a little bit about this before we came online. I'm not a big fan of credentialism, but that's what you hear. Whenever we first see a DNA expert, they talk about all their credentials and all the stuff they did and all the hours of training and all that. All the credentials in the world doesn't matter if you screw up the DNA test, or if the DNA has no evidentiary value, or if you're drawing conclusions that the science doesn't support. So all of those things need to be double checked. And that's what defense attorneys, that's why we have an adversarial process.
Well, and we've had in Florida, I think it's a little bit special. There were some statisticians that were practicing alongside these crime labs and offering testimony for prosecutions that were doing things wrong, that were saying things that were not correct. And I didn't have a means to pursue that. It's a really difficult thing to try to convince a judge that me with no PhD, midlife, and then this old white-haired man with a PhD, that I could know something that he doesn't know, or that he could be mistaken. And that's a big ask for a lot of people. And so I think one of the things that you and I had talked about earlier is that I'm really a proponent for oversight, forensic oversight. The Texas Commission on Forensic Science is a groundbreaking body, and there are some scientific commissions around the country that I think are ineffectual. But if there's one thing that I would like to see happen in every single state in the union, and even on the federal level, I would like to see real meaningful forensic oversight. And it makes me worried because it's a double-edged sword. You know, we would see some people from labs that we recognize are not doing things correct sitting on these commissions, and they might be making some of the rules, and that's scary.
Right.
But
Well, it's kind of like our jury instructions committee it's full of prosecutors, and I've applied to be on it. My supervisor's been applied to be on the committee, and we get systematically excluded because they don't want to hear what we have to say. And then we get in front of a judge, and the judge says, "Well, I'm going to defer to the standard instructions," which were all loaded in by prosecutors.
right.
And it's like, wait a second, we've got all kinds of problems with this standard instruction because of this thing. Well, you bring that up with the committee. Well, we can't get on the committee, right? So it's like it's a sort of this circular thing.
It is.
And
It's very scary and very dangerous, but I don't see that things are going to get better unless it's forced on the community. We can't self-police.
well, and I'm going to use this as a common theme because I'm doing a series of forensics. I'll tell my chat here because my Rumble people, they do watch me occasionally and they do listen sometimes. And I've got my lead in for a false confession expert who is a brilliant guy, who's a buddy of mine. And I'm going to try to lure him onto my little web of Rumble because false confessions are a big issue and most people don't understand that issue. But let's go back to DNA now. So we've talked about mixed DNA profiles. Let's talk about our FDLE labs that still like to talk about tool mark evidence and gunshot matching, one of my pet projects. Now, what kind of oversight is there really over, say, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Essentially none. I mean, they're accredited, but the accrediting body, which is the American National Standards Institute, National Accreditation Board, is not. I filed a complaint against the accrediting body the other day for failure to investigate my concerns in a timely manner, and they agreed with me. That's what we're dealing. That's what we're dealing with.
I love that spit and vinegar in you. That's one of the things this is the thing. You jumped out at me as being my kind of lady because you're a fighter and I love it. And I love the fact that you are not out there, because you're playing real science. So much of this, it gets tainted when it gets into this advocacy role. And to me, a prosecutor, the ideal prosecutor puts on the neutral hat and says, I am going to present the evidence fairly and as given, not become as a weapon of advocacy. But it's so easy to taint the process with advocacy.
Yes, it's a huge problem that I don't know how to stop. The lawyers are asking the questions, right? And the scientists are not in their arena. They don't feel comfortable on the witness stand. They're answering the questions that are being asked. And if they're not asked about limitations of DNA testing, if they aren't asked, does this DNA test that you performed tell you how the DNA got onto an item? No, it doesn't. Does this DNA test that you performed when the DNA was deposited? Are you sure it was deposited at the time of the crime? No, this doesn't tell me that. Those things are so important for the lay people who are going to be making these legal decisions to hear, but often they don't hear them because the lawyers don't ask those questions and they haven't been included in the formal report by the scientists. So I think there's a lot of recommendations that are going to be put forth to make improvements in these areas where the scientists can more freely discuss the limitations in their reports, and that puts everybody on notice.
Okay, go ahead, finish.
No, go ahead.
Well, my thumb's rattling around in my brain from something that was said by my fingerprint expert that came on the other day, and which kind of, I guess I knew it, but I've never had a real good fingerprint case, so I've never delved into it. But he said that there is no wall between the analyst and the collection, so sometimes it's a closed loop. See, it seems to me that the ideal type process would be to have a blind type system that would submit the DNA sample to the lab. The lab coats would be there, would process it, and would spit out a result without peeking behind the curtain and seeing what the other side is. How much of a wall is there, say, in an FDLE?
No, I don't think there's a wall. I have, cases where it's pretty obvious that the analyst was using information from the standards to make decisions about their interpretation. And there's not enough of a disconnect between the people who are performing some of these stages of the testing. And I had a lawyer ask me once, why is DNA any different? So Rosemary Scarpaccio, they did a documentary about one of her cases. It was called Trial 4. It's on Netflix. And she said to me, well, we recognize that in physical lineups that you need to have a 6-pack, and somebody has to prepare profiles from things that are similar, and you include the defendant. But why, when we give somebody a DNA profile, you get the person of interest and only the person of interest, and then you compare them? Why can't you get a 6-pack of profiles and compare those, and somebody selected profiles that are similar to the profile that you have from the person of interest in your case? And it really made a lot of sense to me. We've recognized that bias creeps in other areas of law enforcement and other areas of the human brain, and DNA is no different. And
Right.
There's not enough of a wall, and I think maybe that would be a good thing to do.
That would be a good thing to improve the process. And I'm going to go to the chats a little bit, even though it's not a super chat. I can't get super chats on Rumble. I can only get Rumble rants. But there's a couple people. Chris says, you're almost always right. I wish I could buy you a sidecar. Well, $100 would buy me a sidecar, but we're only $5 in. So you have 95 to go. I don't think we're going to make it tonight. There's no let's go Brandon in the pack here. So we have people that like to pound on the old live streamer with drinks. Tiffany might even be game if we got up enough. But let's see. There's a question that's rattling around here in the chat, and I thought that maybe I'll throw it out to you and see if you know. And that is the question of identical twins. Do identical twins have identical DNA?
They don't have 100% identical DNA, but they have, for the kind of testing that we do in the routine crime lab, the spots that we look at, the 24 locations, identical twins will share the same profile at those 24 locations. Now, if we're going to do whole genome sequencing, we would find some differences. And there have been cases. There was a Boston rape case where one twin pointed the finger at the other twin. And there was Bruce Bedoli, who started the FBI unit, DNA unit. He testified in that case. And then there were some people from Eurofins who did the sequencing tests. In the end, that evidence was excluded because it was just pretty cutting edge, and the judge just didn't think it met the threshold. But that was a very interesting case.
Well, and I was looking up something. There was a Chris Fabricant. One of his major cases that he had was a fellow who was convicted on the science of the bite mark.
Yeah.
And he was released after 35 years for a murder that he did not commit based on DNA evidence that was in fact retained. And this is one of my questions to him was, how did they retain that? He says, because they called up the Virginia. He said, we got a box of evidence here, and it included the rape kit and the DNA. They were able to recover from that and discover the actual perpetrator, who was a major sex offender and had died in prison, and exculpated the fellow who was actually convicted for the murder based on this false bite mark forensic evidence. But what are the policies in the Florida, let's say Florida, because we're both in Florida, we both know Florida, about retaining DNA-laden evidence for purposes of future testing?
I have also a fun fact about the bite mark analysis too. But so essentially, especially for capital cases, they have to retain that evidence indefinitely. And then I think it's going to be statutory based on what the nature of the crime was. But the crime lab, as far as I know, they maintain their samples indefinitely. And they send the original items of evidence back to the police department, and the police department has their own policies about when they're going to release that information or when they're going to dispose of it. So it would really be jurisdictional. You'd have to look, and it's based on what the crime was. But things like bite mark really highlight the importance of preserving the evidence. And the state where I first started to practice as a DNA expert is Massachusetts, and they have case law that says 50% of the evidence that's collected needs to be retained for the defense so the defense can test. And if it can't be retained, the defense they can elect for their own expert to go into the crime lab and watch the testing. And Florida doesn't have any hard and fast rules like that. So I see that, the labs are making an effort not to consume the evidence if they can, but they have no problem consuming it and not notifying anybody. And Massachusetts, with bite mark, one of the problems with the legal process that's different from the scientific process is the scientific process is constantly updating. We're constantly learning about things, the shortcomings of bite mark interpretation, for example. And there's 3 states where the cases that were the first to ever introduce that type of evidence in court were overturned once DNA testing of the actual bite was performed.
What's amazing to me, and we talked about this with Chris the other night, is how prosecutors fight to prevent defense testing of old DNA evidence. I don't understand that. That to me is very bothersome.
Me too. I think I hold the government to a different standard, a higher standard.
We should.
I'm disappointed many times. I think it's also a livelihood, right? These scientists, it's their livelihood. These lawyers, it's their livelihood. And it's often a political environment. And it's about winning, and it's about public perception.
Well, but winning to winning. Well, I had a great prosecutor who trained me when I was in the prosecutor's office named Steve Nelson. He was up in Flagler County for many years. And I remember I had a case, and it was a case, and the jury came back not guilty on a prosecution. It wasn't a big case, a little case, but I remember I was really down about it. I was like, oh man, I was really not guilty, right? And he's like, and this is Nelson, who was great. He was like very high standard of ethics. He says, well, did you get all the evidence in that you should have got in? I was like, well, yes. And did the jury get to hear all the evidence and you presented it? I said, yes. And they made their decision, right? You did your job. They came, respect the jury's verdict. Move on to the next case, right? I mean, your job is to present the evidence fairly and legally and get it admissible evidence in and give it to the jury. And that's their function. It's not my loss. It's presenting the case fairly so that the trier of fact can find it. But instead people become like, I want to win. And that becomes, my audio is evidently getting garbled. Can I ask you, I wanted to segue a little bit more back, a little more personal issue, and that is, you have some things, some cases that you think about, like are some career-making cases that you look back on and say, man, that was a great case. You have some, like a couple really good stories from the Tiffany Boy bag of stories.
No, I had some things happen today that haven't really happened in a consistent way in my career. So this morning, so there was a pretty significant DNA publication that was published yesterday. It was called DNA Mix 21. And it's an interlaboratory study of how laboratories are performing within their lab and across labs. And they tested 67 labs were involved, and they had something like 2,000 different interpretations. And it really highlighted for me the rate of error and the variability across labs. And yesterday I was talking about it with colleagues, and I was posting information about it on LinkedIn. And I actually had the thought, like, I'm never going to overcome this. And the research was very validating for me, because it shows me that what I'm seeing and my feelings about things, like, they saw that also. So it was very life affirming. But I often lament that these crime labs, I can't convince FDLE that they might be wrong, or I can't convince them. And
it's like keeping the defense attorneys off the standard rules committee. It's a mistake, because we should have rules and instructions that are strong. And by withstanding it to the adversarial process, you get a much stronger result. You get it's a fair result determined ahead of time by an objective standard. By this, we're adding elements, and Florida is number 1 in the country for exonerations. And that's a problem. That's an embarrassing statistic for our state, and we should be ashamed, and we should be very actively seeking to address those flaws in our system and why it is. And a lot of it is because of unchecked prosecutorial power.
Yeah, and I mean, even in like Broward, they have a conviction integrity unit, and I go to them with cases where I have serious concerns, and they don't want to hear a thing that I have to say. But today, actually, the manager of the DNA unit at Palm Beach County reached out to me for my input on some procedural changes, and the technical leader from the New York State Police reached out to me, and that's the first time that the crime labs have started to ask me what I think. How can we do this better? What is your opinion? And today that made me feel like I'm making a small difference. I just need to stay the course, and even though it's difficult sometimes, like they'll eventually see that I'm here advocating for the same thing that they're advocating for. I think we all want good science in the courtroom. All the scientists do, and just getting on the same page and making sure everybody gets the training that they need. That's the hill that we have to climb. And I see that there are some people who are actively trying to do that.
Right. Well, and and of course we're getting real aggressive in the death penalty. And just wanted to tell everybody, if you haven't got, look at this. For anybody, I'm telling my rumblers, look at this. This is the first copy. This is the proof copy that I just got of my new book, Death Penalty Debates, Net Positive or Net Negative. So you can now. I've just ordered the first batch, so they will be coming out soon. So please go to stevegosney.com and order it up. My wife would thank you. My mom will thank you, and you will continue to get great content like Tiffany Roy, who's given us some great insights into DNA. Well, and let's kind of, I want to wrap it up a little bit. I know that you've got little ones there, and you're giving me your Friday night. It's wonderful. Thank your family and your husband for your time here. But let me just ask you this: what is the biggest misconception that you see, that that you think that jurors, like general members of the public and potential juror pools, need to hear from somebody who knows DNA?
Just that DNA, we're not using it to identify people. Unless we took a swab from your cheek, we'll never be able to say what the source of the DNA profile is. And so if you think that's what DNA is doing, even when we have gold standard samples, that's not what the expert is telling you. And just that, it's so sensitive now that just because someone's DNA is in a place doesn't mean they were ever there. And just because their DNA isn't there doesn't mean they weren't there. So It's really important to have other pieces of evidence to rely on. There should never just be the one thing.
That's great. Well, God bless you. And anything else, like one more time, just so the people, it's forensicaid.com, right? Is that correct?
Yep. But .net. And
.net. Okay.
My textbook, one of my textbooks that I'm the most proud of is Criminalistics: An Introduction to Forensic Science, and it's in its 13th edition. The previous author was Richard Safrastein. It's a great book. It covers all the different forensic disciplines. It has some case studies in it. I love it, but I'm biased. I recognize my own bias.
Your own bias. Well, like I push my books, and I'm like, this is the best book yet, right? On the death penalty debate, and it is a unique perspective. But I mean, I have to thank for it. It's a lot of people are just trying to support me, and that's wonderful. And that I need all the support I can get, because a lot of us truth tellers are not exactly the popular ones.
That's right.
But it's wonderful. Thank you for sharing your time. And I will tell you, if you're interested, I know that I have a couple other law streamers that would like to ambush you on their channels. So
Sure.
if I can share your name around to some other folks.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. Any platform that anyone will give me, I will speak on it. I'm happy to educate, and I'm happy to advocate for forensic oversight and deposition. If you work in a state where you don't have deposition of experts and forensic science oversight, those are my missions.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you very. Oh, and your other book too, I was looking, is you have a book on how to pass the exam.
Yeah. Like, so when I took the bar, there were professional exam preparation texts, and for forensic scientists, because certification is not like legal licensure, that's not mandatory, there's almost nothing to help these scientists take these certification tests. And it's a really important standard of quality to show your minimum qualifications, that you can pass the certification test, that you bind yourself to these ethical codes. It's really important. So I just try to create more material to help them achieve that important goal, I guess.
Well, stay true. You are right on what you're doing, and that you're a gift. See that, and like it's the defense attorneys, and we should be really working together on a lot of this because we, like you said, we want the best science in the courtroom because it by injecting error into it, we get false confessions, and it's very bad for the entire system. So you're in the right. I love your advocacy. I love your passion and your commitment to the truth. You just stay true to yourself. You're great, and give the family my thank you for loaning you for this hour.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank everyone for their attention.
God bless you.
Good night.